Welcome back to True Crime After Dark, where we unravel the darkest corners of the human mind. It begins in the kind of quiet that makes people feel safe. A calm Texas night, a 4-year-old girl asleep in her bed, and a 13-year-old brother standing in the dark, not with the innocence of a child, but with a decision already made. Before the world even knew his name, Paris Lee Bennett was in the hallway of his family's home, holding an intent so cold it would scar every life connected to him forever. There was no warning scream heard through the neighborhood, no crash, no threat, no sign sent ahead to the world that something was about to be ripped apart. Inside that house, little Ella, just 4 years old, was the picture of everything untouched and gentle, and nearby, the brother she trusted was about to become the reason she would never see another morning. When he picked up the phone to dial 911, his voice didn't shake. He didn't stumble over the words. He told the dispatcher what he had done like he was reading a script only he had known existed. The operator tried to guide him, calm him, question him, but even they would later admit there was something off in the way he spoke. Too measured, too composed, too aware. By the time first responders stepped through the doorway, the truth was already irreversible. Ella Bennett, only 4 years old, was gone. And the older brother who should have been her protector didn't deny it. He claimed it. But this wasn't a story that started in the hallway or the bedroom or the 911 call. To understand the weight of what happened, you have to hold 2 lives in the same frame. A child with a knife in his hand, and a mother who had no idea that grief was already pulling up a chair at her table. Charity Lee was at work that night, a single mother doing what she had to do to keep them afloat. She trusted that her children were safe. She trusted the quiet. She trusted the routine. She had no reason to know that the last normal evening of her life was already over. By the time she was told what happened, by the time someone formed the words that no mother should hear, everything inside her body rejected it. Even now, years later, she says the brain tries to save you in those first seconds. It tries to fold time in half so it makes no sense. It tries to protect you from a reality that no human being is wired to accept, that your child is dead and your other child is the reason. Police and prosecutors wouldn't take long to understand the logistics of the crime. What they struggled with, what the whole country struggled with when the story came out, was the why. Paris wasn't in a rage. He wasn't cornered or threatened. He wasn't acting out of panic or fear. He made a choice, and later he would explain that choice with words so calculated they would chill even seasoned investigators. But that night, before the world heard his explanations, investigators walked through the home with the unnerving knowledge that the killer was barely a teenager. They spoke to him, not like a child in shock, but like someone who knew exactly what had unfolded. Paris answered their questions, not with wild emotion, but with a clarity that terrified them more than any outburst could have. And as the hours turned into the beginning of the next day, Charity arrived at the intersection of the unthinkable. She wasn't allowed to hold her little girl again. There was no goodbye, no last touch. And the son she had raised, the boy she thought she understood, was suddenly a stranger behind a wall of police reports and statements and courtroom procedures. She would say later, in interviews and in writing, that the sound a mother makes in that moment is not fully human. It's part scream, part collapse, part animal. It rises from a place so deep there aren't words for it in any language. Because how can words exist for something like that? Paris was taken into custody. The world didn't yet know the details, but behind the scenes, authorities were already contending with the reality. A 13-year-old had committed a murder so deliberate that the law would treat him as a violent offender with full intent. There are crimes people explain away with environment, panic, influence. This wasn't one of them. This was a boy who waited until his mother was gone. A boy who had the freedom to walk away, to call someone, to do anything else, but didn't. And while reporters hadn't yet descended on Abilene, and documentaries hadn't been filmed, that house was already a crime scene, and a grieving mother was already being asked questions no parent should ever face. What came next will take us into police interviews, recorded confessions, prosecution decisions, and later, years later, an on-camera admission that would horrify the world. Because Paris didn't just say he killed his sister. He said he did it to cause pain to his mother. And he said it with a level of clarity that still makes people go cold when they hear it. But before the rest of the world learned those words, Charity was alone with a truth she could barely speak aloud. Her son had killed her daughter. Her family was gone in one night. And the person she brought into the world was the one who ended another life she made. The trial would not be like most juvenile cases. The sentence would not be short. And the consequences wouldn't just fall on Paris. They would follow Charity every single day after. And before we go any deeper into what drove him, how the investigation unfolded, and how Charity tried to survive the aftermath, I want to remind everyone listening. Stories like this matter because silence protects no one. If you're watching right now, please make sure you like this video, drop a comment about where you're watching from, and subscribe so we can keep telling the stories of victims who can no longer speak for themselves. Now, back to that night. When investigators questioned Paris for the first time, they didn't meet a chaotic child. They met someone who understood that Ella was dead, that he caused it, and that people would now judge him for it. One officer would later say that it wasn't the brutality that shocked him most, it was the calm. But long before anyone would learn about the motive Paris later revealed on television, Charity was still trying to reconcile two realities: the baby boy she had rocked and loved and raised, and the truth about what he had done to her little girl. And this is where the story deepens. Paris wasn't born a headline. He wasn't born a killer. He came into the world like every other child, small, new, and in the arms of a mother who believed love could be enough. Charity was young when she had him, carrying her own history of trauma long before the world ever learned her name. She had survived addiction, loss, and instability, and she poured everything she had into raising Paris with the hope that his story would be different from hers. By the time Paris was old enough to walk, he was already showing signs of being exceptionally bright. He spoke early, understood things beyond his age, and asked questions most adults had to think about before answering. Teachers would later say he wasn't just intelligent, he was gifted. But intelligence doesn't always translate to emotional stability, and there were shadows in him that no one fully understood at the time. Charity worked hard to build a better life. There was no perfect stability, but there was love, routine, and the belief that things were moving in the right direction. And then, years after Paris was born, came Ella. When Ella arrived, Charity said it felt like life was giving her a second chance. Another child, a little girl, soft and bright and full of laughter. To most people who saw them, Paris appeared to be a protective older brother. He held her, read to her, helped her with toys, smiled in photos by her side, with no visible indication of what would one day come. But some people close to the family would later recall flickers. Moments where Paris seemed jealous of the attention Ella received. Not in the way most siblings get jealous, but something quieter, deeper, harder to place. Charity spoke in later interviews about times she thought he was struggling with sharing her, but she believed those were things that time and reassurance could fix. There were therapists in his earlier years, evaluations even, but nothing that screamed danger. No one predicted murder. No one imagined the child they saw would one day say he did it out of revenge. In the home, Ella was light. She was playful, affectionate, silly in the way only a 4-year-old can be. She adored her brother. She followed him around. She trusted him without hesitation. She didn't know anything about pain or betrayal or fear. She just knew that Paris was her big brother and that big brothers are supposed to love you. Charity kept working, doing the best she could as a single mother. She made mistakes like all parents do, but the story people forget is this: she never imagined Paris would harm his sister. Even when a child shows signs of struggle, no parent jumps straight to horror. You think in terms of therapy, adjustment, support. You don't think in terms of funerals. There were moments, though, when Paris's behavior hinted at something darker. A few troubling incidents, anger, manipulation, lying, but they didn't add up to what he would eventually do. At 13, most kids are worrying about middle school, video games, friends, and homework. Paris had something else taking root inside him. Years later, in interviews from prison, He would speak about Ella with an unsettling absence of remorse. He didn't cry. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't talk like someone who made a mistake. He talked like someone who made a decision. And that decision wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't chaotic. It was planned. But before we unravel his motive and the chilling explanation he eventually gave to the world, there's something you have to understand about Charity. She loved both of her children. She loved Ella with the soft, open love that mothers carry, and she loved Paris with the fierce, determined love of someone who believed she could save him from his past, from his genetics, from himself. That love would later become the most painful part of the story. Because loving Paris meant living with the knowledge of what he did, and loving Ella meant living with the hole that could never be filled. People often ask if there were signs. And Charity has said more than once that hindsight creates ghosts out of moments that once seemed harmless. A comment here. A stare that lingered too long. A silence you didn't question at the time. But no one looking in from the outside saw a killer in the making. They saw a brilliant kid with potential. And that's what made the night of February 4th so haunting. Not just because of what happened, but because of how little warning the world believes it had. Years after the crime, when Paris spoke publicly, he made it clear he understood exactly what Ella meant to their mother. And that's why he took her. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't fear. It was intentional heartbreak. But before we get to that confession, and we will, there's another layer people often miss. Charity's past. Her father was murdered in a restaurant shooting years before Ella's death. She had already known what it was to survive trauma, to bury someone you love, to hold unanswered questions. She had spent years rebuilding from the wreckage of that loss. And then it happened again, this time from inside her own family. She once said that the night she lost Ella felt like her soul was cracking open in the same place it was still trying to heal. Except this time, the pain came with betrayal attached. A betrayal so total that it didn't just break her, it redefined her. And Paris, he knew about her past. He knew about the first murder, and he admitted later that he chose a method of destruction that would echo that original wound. That's not impulse. That's surgical. But long before those details came out, before the world heard him speak on camera, Charity was left in a hospital corridor identifying her daughter's body. She was left staring at the child she brought into the world, knowing that another one of her children had taken that life away. She has said in interviews that there is no handbook for being the mother of both a murdered child and the murderer. There is no support group, no step-by-step recovery guide. There is just breath, and the decision to take the next one. And as investigators gathered statements, documented the crime scene, and processed the unimaginable, Paris sat calmly. He didn't cry. He didn't ask for his mother. He didn't collapse. He waited. The system moved fast. They charged him with capital murder. He was just 13, but the brutality and intent behind the act forced the court to treat him like someone far older. Lawyers, judges, psychologists. They all tried to find the boundaries of what it means when a child commits a crime too dark to fit inside childhood. But if anyone thought remorse would show up eventually, they were wrong. And we'll get there, piece by piece. If you're still with this story, and you're one of the people who refuses to look away from what really happens behind closed doors, don't forget to like this video, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe so we can keep the voices of these victims from being silenced forever. Because Ella cannot speak. But her story still must. Now, let's go to the night before everything shattered and the choices Paris made long before he ever picked up the phone. In the hours before Ella died, nothing in the house screamed danger. There wasn't a fight. There wasn't a meltdown. There wasn't a single alert that anyone outside those walls could have seen coming. Charity was at work, doing what any parent would do to keep the lights on and food in the kitchen. A babysitter had been there earlier, watching the children until Paris assured everyone he could handle the rest of the night. He was 13, but he knew how to sound older when it served him. He was polite, articulate, capable. When he said everything was fine, people believed him. And why wouldn't they? The surface of his life didn't show a fracture, but under that calm exterior was something calculated, something waiting. While Ella slept in her small room, surrounded by toys and the soft comfort of being 4 and unaware of danger, Paris was awake. Investigators would later reconstruct a timeline from phone records, interviews, and what he eventually admitted. He didn't act out of sudden impulse. He waited until the home was quiet. He waited until everyone who could stop him was gone. In the courtroom later, prosecutors and psychologists talked about motive, mindset, and opportunity. But the simplest truth was this: Paris made a decision that required planning. He chose a time when his mother wasn't home. He chose a moment when Ella was defenseless, and he chose not to walk away. There's a question people always ask about this case. Why not run? Why not scream? Why not tell someone you're struggling? The answer Paris gave the world years later was colder than anyone expected. He said he didn't want help. He wanted impact. And on that night, before his confession was recorded, before his interviews were televised, he crossed the line from thought to action. The 911 call he made after was eerie in its composure. The dispatcher asked questions. Paris answered. No hysterics, no confusion, no panic. Even trained professionals have admitted they were stunned by how flat his voice was, how devoid of the typical shock that follows violence. When first responders arrived, the weight of the scene hit them immediately. Some of them were fathers. Some had children Ella's age. And all of them would carry that night with them long after the paperwork was filed. Walking into a home where a 4-year-old has been killed is already unbearable. Learning that the perpetrator is her teenage brother, that takes the human mind a moment to even process. Paris didn't resist arrest. He didn't plead for his mother. He didn't offer explanation. He stated facts. And when they placed him in the back of the patrol car, he didn't shed a tear. Charity was still at work when the knock came. She didn't know yet which child was hurt. She didn't know yet who was alive and who wasn't. The only thing louder than fear in her chest was the disbelief trying to keep her upright. She has said that the silence between hearing there'd been an incident and learning the truth stretched like a lifetime. It was only when they told her that Ella was gone, and that Paris had done it, that time stopped making sense. She didn't get to hold Ella's hand. She didn't get to hear a doctor say they tried everything. She didn't get a chance to run toward her child and pretend that love could pull her back. Ella was already gone, and the son she thought she knew was gone in an entirely different way. There are parents who lose a child to illness, others to accidents, others to strangers. But to lose one child because of another, that's a kind of horror no language has prepared for. The legal system moved quickly. They charged him with capital murder. He was just 13, but the brutality and intent behind the act forced the court to treat him like someone far older. Lawyers, judges, psychologists, they all tried to find the boundaries of what it means when a child commits a crime too dark to fit inside childhood. But if anyone thought remorse would show up eventually, they were wrong. But the public wouldn't hear about the motive until years later, when Paris sat in front of cameras and explained, in his own words, exactly why he did it. Before that explanation ever aired, though, Charity stepped into the dual role life had forced on her: grieving mother and mother of the accused. She once said that the night she lost Ella and the night Paris was taken away weren't two separate moments. They were one violent tear. In those early days, she still visited him, still believed there had to be some part of the boy she loved inside the one behind glass. She said love doesn't vanish just because horror walks in, but it changes. It gets quiet. It watches. It waits for answers. Meanwhile, investigators pieced together the events leading up to the crime. They learned that Paris had waited for the babysitter to leave. They confirmed that he chose not to call Charity before acting. They noted his behavior after the fact: clean, composed, deliberate. They sent him for psychological assessments. They combed through his history. They looked for signs they might have missed, and what they found would be debated for years. Was he born this way? Was it triggered by something specific? Had the darkness been visible all along, or did it grow in places no one thought to look? And while the legal system prepared to try a 13-year-old for murder, the media began to catch wind of the case. A brother killing a sister is rare. A child killing a child is rarer. And a motive like his, once revealed, would become one of the darkest documented in modern juvenile crime. But before the world heard him say he wanted to punish his mother, long before he told interviewers that killing Ella was a calculated act to inflict lifelong pain, Charity was still trying to survive the reality in front of her. She was planning a funeral for one child and legal visits for the other. She was facing reporters, caseworkers, whispers, and judgment. People who didn't know her speculated about what kind of mother she must have been. People who didn't know Paris insisted there had to have been warning signs. What they didn't understand was that evil doesn't always show its face. Sometimes it hides in Sunday clothes and good grades. Sometimes it smiles in family photos. Sometimes it holds a baby sister on its lap, and no one sees the tension in the grip. In the coming years, Paris would speak for himself. He would tell the world why he chose Ella. He would describe it with a dispassion that froze interviewers in their seats, and those words would change the way people saw the case forever. And that's where we're headed next, into the mind of a child who made a decision no child should be capable of, and into the heart of a mother who had to keep breathing after the worst night of her life. In the weeks after the murder, investigators and psychologists began the long process of trying to understand what Paris had done and why he had done it with such chilling calm. They questioned him again and again, looking for cracks in his composure, some sign of breakdown, panic, or regret. But what they found instead was clarity. Paris didn't spin a story. He didn't blame voices or blackout rage or confusion. He remembered details. He remembered choices. And what unsettled professionals the most was that he didn't describe the night like a tragedy. He described it like a plan he had executed. He was sent for full psychological evaluation. They wanted to know if there was psychosis, dissociation, trauma-triggered impairment, anything beyond pure intent. They looked into his mental health history. He'd been through counseling in earlier years after behavioral issues surfaced. Lying, manipulative behavior, emotional distancing. But none of the professionals at the time could have predicted what he would do to his little sister. Even now, people ask the same two questions. Was Paris born this way, or was he made this way? And the truth is, nobody has found a satisfying answer. Some psychologists pointed to his intelligence, how he used it not for curiosity, but control. Others pointed to early childhood experiences and genetics, referencing mental health and addiction in the family tree. But Charity, who knew his baby pictures, his bedtime routines, his first words, has said in multiple interviews that she believed there were things happening inside him long before she could see them. She has also been open about the guilt that mothers carry, the sense that if you had just looked 1 inch deeper, noticed one moment harder, maybe you could have stopped it. But guilt is only hindsight wearing a mask of responsibility. She didn't know. She couldn't have known. And it wasn't her hands that acted that night. As the state built its case, prosecutors gathered everything they needed to prove intent. They documented the timeline. They confirmed the babysitter had left. They verified that Paris had time to walk away, to call someone, to stop himself. They made it clear this wasn't an accident, and it wasn't an explosion. It was a directed act. Eventually, he pleaded guilty to capital murder. He was 13, but the weight of what he did gave the court no room for leniency. The sentence, 40 years. Under Texas law, parole eligibility comes after 20. That year, 2027, is now a date that lives in the back of Charity's mind, like a shadow that hasn't stepped into the light yet. After sentencing, Paris went into a juvenile facility, then later into an adult unit as he aged. And for a while, he kept his thoughts to himself. He refused most interviews. He didn't speak publicly. He read books, wrote letters, passed time. It wasn't until he was approached for documentaries and interview series that the rest of the world started to hear directly from him. And when he finally spoke about motive, he didn't stumble. He didn't soften it. He said he knew exactly what Ella meant to their mother, and that's why he chose her. He said he wanted to punish Charity. He said that killing her outright would have been over too quickly. But taking Ella? That was permanent. That was damage that wouldn't fade. That was a wound he believed she would feel every day for the rest of her life. And the way he said it, the lack of shame, the absence of grief, the almost academic delivery, is what made people freeze in their seats when the footage first surfaced. Even the interviewer's face couldn't hide the shock. You expect remorse from a juvenile murderer. You expect denial or confusion or tears. But remorse never arrived. Not in the courtroom, not in the interviews, not in the years behind bars. What you see instead is someone who did something irreversible and does not regret the effect, only the consequences of getting caught. But to truly understand what that motive meant, you have to go back to Charity's past. The part of her life most people never knew until it all came out. Years before Ella was born, before Paris turned 13, before that night in Abilene, Charity lost someone else she loved to murder. Her father was shot and killed in a restaurant. She had already buried a parent because of violence. She had already learned that grief can wake you harder than any alarm. Paris knew this. He knew her history, and he has acknowledged, in his own words, that he used that pain against her. That's not childish impulse, that's surgical cruelty. But while people watched those interviews with horror, Charity lived with that knowledge in real time, long before the public ever heard it. She used to visit Paris in prison. She used to sit across from him, face to face, trying to reconcile the son she knew as a baby with the person who took Ella from the world. For a long time, she believed that connection was still possible, that maybe somehow she could help him grow into someone different than the boy who made that call. But eventually, her instincts changed. She got quieter. She stepped back. She made decisions based on safety. For herself, for her younger child born years after Ella's death, and for the memory of the daughter she lost. People judge that without understanding it. Some say, how could she still talk to him? Others ask, how could she ever turn away? But unless you have stood in her body on that night, with 2 children gone in 2 different ways, you don't get to measure her choices. Paris will be eligible for parole in 2027. He may not receive it, but eligibility means review. And review means re-evaluating the danger of a man who once said that emotional destruction was not a side effect, but the goal. Before we go any further into what his prison years have looked like and what comes next, I want to remind anyone still watching, these stories matter because they protect memory, and they force us to confront the things we'd rather believe children aren't capable of in the end. What happened in that Texas home will never fully make sense to the world beyond it. A 13-year-old boy made a choice that shattered a family, ended a little girl's life, and rewrote the course of his mother's existence forever. Investigators called it calculated. Prosecutors called it intentional. And in his own words, years later, Paris made it clear he understood exactly what he was doing. He didn't kill Ella out of confusion or fear. He did it to cause permanent pain to the person who loved them both. And that truth is what makes this case unlike so many others involving juvenile offenders. It wasn't chaos. It was vengeance, born in the mind of someone still legally a child. Charity was left with a reality no parent could prepare for. 1 child buried, 1 behind bars, and the impossible work of surviving both losses at once. For years, she tried to love the son who destroyed her world while protecting the memory of the daughter she'll never hold again. Over time, she stepped back for safety, for sanity, for survival. But the ache didn't end when the cameras left or when the courtroom doors closed. Paris will be eligible for parole in 2027. He may stay behind bars for decades more, or the system may one day weigh his words and actions again. But no legal outcome will undo the night he took Ella's life, or the lifelong sentence handed to the mother left behind. And that's why stories like this have to be told, not to sensationalize the horror, but to make sure the victims are never reduced to a footnote in someone else's crime. Ella was 4 years old. She was bright and tender and trusting. She loved her brother. She loved her mother. She had a future waiting for her that she never got to see. And long after documentaries stop running and headlines fade away, what matters most is that her name continues to be spoken, not just the name of the person who took her away. So before we close this out, I'm asking one last time, If you believe these stories should never disappear into silence, please like this video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe so we can keep the voices of these victims alive and heard. Your engagement helps us carry their names forward when they can't speak for themselves. And now, for Ella. This is for the little girl whose laughter once filled a home that became a crime scene. For the child who went to sleep believing she was safe. For the life that should have stretched across decades but was stolen in a single night. We will remember her, not as a headline, not as a tragedy, but as a life that mattered. We will always remember Ella Bennett. May she rest in peace, and may her voice never be silenced.